Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says that US-backed enemies of his country have launched an economic war against him. He also claims opposition leaders have worked together in an effort to assassinate him and that they tried to overthrow him through violent street protests. Despite pointing the finger of blame at US President Donald Trump, Maduro still wants to meet the American president face to face. But in 2017, the White House responded to a similar request by saying such a meeting would only take place if Venezuela returned to democracy. Diplomatic relations between Venezuela and the United States have been tense since the now dead socialist president Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. Both Chavez and Maduro, his successor, have accused Washington of assassination attempts against them. Meanwhile, Trump has imposed financial sanctions on Venezuela and its state oil company. He has even imposed sanctions on President Maduro's wife and several of his top allies to further increase pressure on the government. Venezuela also accuses the United States of encouraging its emigration crisis to embarrass Caracas, which has the world's largest proven oil reserves, but is in full economic collapse. Pro-government supporters of President Maduro have taken to the streets to protest against American interference after reports that US officials met secretly with Venezuelan military officers to discuss plans to get rid of Maduro. Why does the United States seek to interfere so much in South American matters? And could it have anything to do with Venezuela's huge oil reserves? Simple questions with important answers. Let's start with this. What, in the public's view here in the UK, has caused the economic crisis in Venezuela? We put that to them. Here's what they said.
I don't blame them. I think if we had the inflation here is bad enough. I mean, it's nothing compared to 1.7 million. I'm talking, what's it here, 2-3%? You know, it's bad enough for people living in London, I suppose.
I am a humanitarian, and I do believe everyone should have an equal way of living. Saying that, I do think we need to think about Britain, England first.
Yeah, well, it sounds as though whoever's in charge of the economy and general whatever, he's not doing a very good job of it.
Well, I think this is obviously very concerning, and it affects those who are least able to absorb the consequences of it. So.
The economic crisis is due to an economic war against our country on an international and national level. Countries like the US fuel a blockade which makes it very difficult to buy goods and services for the locals' welfare. The Venezuelan opposition does the same through their company owners who don't produce the goods they should.
Private companies are committing sabotage. International media develops a war against our country. Illegal forex is harming the economy. US-backed businessmen undermine production, and also US blockades denies Venezuela access to food and medicine.
One of the main problems of our country is the international blockade implemented by the US President Donald Trump against our people. Ever since he's been in office, there's been a huge campaign to make Venezuela look like a country that is very poorly ruled by President Nicolas Maduro.
Specifically corruption. It comes from the lack of checks and lack of ethics. Most of all, the lack of socialist ethics. In this context, somehow the fingers point at the government as responsible for this.
The situation is due to all food prices getting higher and higher quickly, while workers' salaries do not get high enough to buy such foods. I think prices should be frozen and salaries should be raised.
This country's economic crisis is, in my opinion, related to a conflict between the government and business owners in Venezuela, as many people have the cultural tendency to deal with the crisis by breaking rules, while government, despite its multiple efforts, has not yet imposed enough control over companies.
It's mainly the result of a very well-planned economic war, which has been going on since 1998 but intensified in 2003. This involves contraband, fracking to reduce the price of oil, it involves currency speculation, and it involves now financial asphyxiation, economic sanctions and blockade. Plus, locally, The right wing are doing everything possible, such as hoarding, speculating with everything and producing inflation deliberately. The result is pretty bad. It's reminiscent of what was done to Salvador Allende in the 70s.
There are many reasons why Venezuela is in crisis. There's been a level of mismanagement by the government. We can't deny that. Also, the excessive dependency of Venezuela on the income for export of oil. It is around 95% of all the income comes from oil. That dependency has affected them because when the drop of the oil prices happened in 2014 and they never recovered properly, they lost a great deal of currency, a great deal of income because of that. So they depended far too much on that. But at the same time, the sanctions have been affecting the economy of Venezuela in many ways. Just to give you an example, the government in the US has blocked the repatriation of of benefits of income from one of Venezuela's oil subsidiaries in the US. That means $1 million gone lost because the US does not allow this subsidiary to repatriate this money to Venezuela. So they are losing money. At the same time, they are not allowing to make economic financial transactions, which means that Venezuela doesn't have access to hard currency. So that's another reason why the situation is bad. Apart from that, the exchange rate control that Venezuela has implemented since 2003 has made it possible for a black market to thrive and create inflation because the exchange rate in the black market is much higher than it is officially. So that's some of the elements which have contributed to the economic crisis in Venezuela.
Why does the United States constantly try to interfere with South American matters? Here's what the public said.
Donald Trump, surely. I suppose everyone's going to try and point it towards Donald Trump. It's not just one person. There's many other factors to it, but yeah, you'd have to ask the president, I suppose.
America always does have a little input in everyone's affairs, and unfortunately, Britain's always the first one to jump to back them, which I have a problem with slightly.
As is Cuba. So, I mean, they had a big problem. They got a big problem, or did have a big problem with Cuba. So, anything happening down south of them, they need to know about, and that's probably why they try and influence it, I suppose.
I don't think it's just the United States. I think it's any power, as we see around the world, geopolitical conflicts.
The US regards Latin American countries as if they were a backyard. The US sees these as smaller countries that must be dominated. It seems that US foreign policy is still based on the colonization era.
The United States believes to be the owner of all underdeveloped countries. Now that Venezuela is emerging towards development, the US pretends to impose the dollar currency domination. However, President Nicolas Maduro has launched a Venezuelan cryptocurrency known as Petro, which is already bringing good results.
The US believes to have the power of ruling Venezuela because, unfortunately, many Venezuelan opponents to the government are influencing and brainwashing others to make them believe the Maduro administration is ruining the country and therefore a US military intervention is necessary.
Let's remember Salvador Allende, overthrown by a US-backed coup in Chile despite being elected. Leftist governments obey the people, while rightist governments, as the one in the US, are used to invading independent countries and taking away their resources.
I disagree with the US because we are a democratic country with freedom of speech and we make the decisions we want. So we have decided to have Nicolas Maduro as our president. The US grudge against us is because they want to own our oil, but they won't get it.
The US exercises a superpower over South America that has been very clear since ancient times, so this is an empire which will not be easily stripped of power. As a matter of fact, the US has a military machinery that is able to intervene in any country of the world.
The United States nearly lost hegemony, up to 2008, 2010, because many of the countries moved to the left. And they have been in the process of trying to recover it. And the jewel in the crown, or the cherry in the pie, is Venezuela. And there are two reasons for it. Venezuela is resistance in every possible sense, and Venezuela has been the leading country reorganizing the whole continent, proposing regional integration and so on, including regional bodies such as the CELAC, which is all the countries except Canada and the United States together, UNASUR, which is all the South American countries coming together, plus policies on energy, banking and so on to become independent from the IMF, etc. And on top of all of this, Venezuela has huge amounts of oil, the largest in the world. And the United States want to ensure that, one, it recovers hegemony, and two, it controls the supply of oil. Therefore, the government has to go.
The US has always considered Latin America as its backyard. It's sort of a place where the many strategic interests happened. And this happens from before the Cold War. In this particular case, Venezuela is a bad example for the Latin American countries because it's a left-wing government. It's been going on since 1999, since President Chavez was first elected until now, and they see it as a threat. But at the same time, in the case of Venezuela, Venezuela has the biggest reserves of oil on the planet, and they want to have access to that. We know that the US has always started wars in areas where there is oil. We have seen the example in Iraq and the Middle East. This is another case of trying to promote an opposition government which will enable the US to acquire control over this reserve, which they really want to grab. And so that's one of the reasons why the US does that. But at the same time, it's a strategic reason. The US needs Latin America to be on its side because it considers a good strategic backyard against, in this particular case, Russia and China, who are exercising a great deal of influence in Latin America these days.
Venezuela also accuses the United States of encouraging the Venezuelan emigration crisis in order to embarrass Caracas, which also happens to have the world's largest known oil reserves. What are the public's thoughts?
It makes sense. They've done it in the Middle East. It's probably caused most of the wars, isn't it, over the past 50 years, 30 years,
Well, oil has a lot to do with everything, and especially when it comes to certain other countries.
Yeah, I would think so, yes. Anything to do with oil is going to be, same with us on the other side, Iraq, etc. But yeah, I would think so. The answer is yes.
I couldn't answer that, I'm afraid.
Although some of our people have left the country, the migration isn't as big as the media tries to make it look. Venezuela still has a large working population. In fact, many who left are now back because when they were abroad, they suffered forced labor and lack of labor laws.
Many Venezuelan migrants are returning home because they experienced working exploitation in other countries, working over 12 hours daily without a break, 6 days a week. Now they found out that Venezuela is a paradise where people can happily live.
Yes, there are Venezuelans fleeing our country, but that is due to misinformation. Many fellow citizens are vulnerable and exposed to US propaganda that portrays the fake American dream of a better life for migrants in their land.
In the name of democracy and peace, the US regards other countries as their backyard. Now it has an obsession over Venezuela, promoting its regime's collapse and expecting to take away Venezuelan oil reserves.
Many Venezuelans have certainly left the country because of economic problems, despite solutions that can be found at home. The US and others have misled our people by offering fake opportunities of a better living. In the end, our people suffer discrimination abroad and consequently return home being disappointed.
Of course, the US scheme is to undermine Venezuela's reputation worldwide over the migration issue. Despite there are ongoing economic problems, making many Venezuelans feel like leaving their home country to find a solution. However, many who have already left for other countries have experienced more hardship as migrants.
I think they decided to resort to the humanitarian migration crisis in inverted commas, because everything else failed. They tried absolutely everything. Waves of violence that lasted 6 months with the explicit aim to overthrow the government. They tried recall referendum, which failed. They tried to win elections, economic war, and so on, and they know that nothing works. So the US came to the conclusion, in my view, that the domestic Venezuelan opposition is pretty useless, quite incompetent. So they decided to take the matter into their own hands. In that case, they needed some external source of justification, and as a result of that, they went for the humanitarian crisis in order to force some sort of military intervention from outside with some legitimacy, which is what they're trying to do now.
Obviously, many people are leaving Venezuela because there's hunger in Venezuela. It would be absurd to deny that. And there is a crisis. It hasn't reached the level of a humanitarian crisis as it happens in, say, South Sudan, for example, as the UN would define it, but it is a crisis. And of course, they have used this as a good excuse, not only the US, but also the countries who are hostile to Venezuela in Latin America, to use this as an excuse to intervene in Venezuela. Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, a man I could consider easily, and I don't use this term lightly, a puppet of the US, has not ruled out a military intervention that they call humanitarian intervention in Venezuela, something which has been rejected even by countries within the region who are enemies of Venezuela. So we are talking about a situation where the US is trying to take advantage of this, and the countries which are hostile to Venezuela want to take advantage of this to justify an intervention in the country.
Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, estimated to be around 300 billion barrels of oil, compared to America's 35 billion barrels. But it also has one of the world's highest inflation rates, estimated by the International Monetary Fund to hit 1.37 million% by the end of 2018. This is one reason why, over the last few years, 2.3 million Venezuelans have left their own country. What, in the view of the public, makes the United States so able to impose its own sanctions on other countries?
We should rather be, leaders than followers. Everyone seems to follow America and what they want and what they demand. So.
They always stick in their nose in people's business, and unfortunately, I think they need to sort their own country out.
They feel they've got clout, and so they don't want their economy mucked up. So they feel they can possibly push their weight about a bit, I suppose.
They're the biggest economy in the world. People need to trade with the US.
Unfortunately, the currency that rules the transactions involving goods and services is the US dollar, so it's been hard for the Venezuelan government to make imports due to the dollar ban.
The US is a country that disrespects the United Nations. The US pretends to take property over poor countries. Because Venezuela is amongst countries who are accomplishing independence and progress, the US tries to isolate and suffocate it in economic terms.
I consider the US has no legal authority over the issues or developments of our country. We have President Nicolas Maduro, who is the legitimate leader enabled by the people to determine what is good or bad for citizens.
The US is surely doing its old job, inflicting damage into Venezuela to see its government fall down. Hugo Chavez said they were strategic operations that are launched for a coup in the face of the world and the Venezuelans with no remorse.
US sanctions are illegal. It is the United Nations who can sanction other countries. The US pretends to rule all countries around the world and designate their presidents. This is unacceptable.
No nation has the right to unilaterally sanction other nations, so I think that there should be a real international court to impede this.
It's mainly because of the dollar. Oil is priced in dollars. The stock exchange market in the United States, in Wall Street, in New York, is crucial. The United States is extremely powerful. I think on the one hand, it can exert a huge amount of power through multilateral bodies such as the IMF, the World Bank, and many others, but also it has control of a huge, flow of finances, and therefore it can blockade you. And the reason why it does is because it knows it can get away with it. Because who is going to do anything to sanction the United States for acting this illegally? In fact, everything the United States is doing against Venezuela is completely illegal, and it violates international law the same way it does with Cuba and so on, but it's big enough to act as a bully.
Because they have allies in the region. You see, without the complicity of countries in the region, Venezuela, the US could not impose sanctions. It enables them because they have, as I said, some subsidiaries. In the case of Venezuela, some oil subsidiaries of Venezuela based in the US. They can withhold that repatriation of that kind of money to Venezuela. That enables the US to implement the sanctions, but also the influence it has in other countries. Scandinavian countries, which are supposed to be liberal, have been blockading financial transactions to and from Venezuelan banks, which is contributing to these sanctions. At the same time, they have have made the situation in the health service even worse because they have blocked transactions which would enable the Venezuelan government to acquire medicines, anti-malaria vaccines, and equipment, for the health service. There's concrete examples of blocks by the US and other countries to the import of these basic medical supplies that Venezuela needs to solve its very serious and grave health service crisis.
We wondered if the public had an opinion about what Venezuelan President Maduro could do to improve the economy of Venezuela if those sanctions were lifted.
Wouldn't have a clue. I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to try and waffle it and look good on camera. I wouldn't have a clue. And I'm sure 90% of the other people that you'd speak to in the UK wouldn't have a clue either. But yeah, America, stop bullying everyone.
Their government is not as clean as they make out to be, and it has an impact on society. So I think a lot of people need to stop interfering on other people's countries and sort their own government out first.
Unless they vote the bloke out who's making a rough job of it, without having a revolution and probably a load of bloodshed, there's not a lot you can do, I suppose. But you can only advise them to do better than they are. But in my humble opinion,
I do believe in the free market system. We've seen socialism not do as well as those proponents of it have expected it to do.
In his diplomacy, I recommend him to remember that foreign affairs are driven by interests instead of ideology. Consequently, many times it's important to make some concessions. This doesn't mean giving away sovereignty or territory, but buying time so any agreement is possible.
In my opinion, we must produce everything we consume, mostly medicine. It is also needed to supervise pharmacies and drugstore chains, which are involved in black market sales. This policy will improve people's access to medicine.
For a serious solution, the country's economic production system must be activated and to supervise its members, not only private company owners, but also the community groups or organizations. Reinforcing food distribution state programs is also a good idea.
Newly created laws, such as the agreed price law, that will work properly once they start to be implemented, and the moment to start is now. A general audit must be made within the government itself, as there are officials who actually oppose our revolution and cause damage from the inside.
Because food scarcity is a problem, I think that food production and distribution must be improved in order to satisfy citizens. An agreement with food-producing companies is also necessary.
The solution of the economic problem is based on making Venezuela produce all goods that are needed to satisfy the population, plus establishing consumption priorities, as well as improving distribution and regulations.
Well, you can imagine, in the first place, it will start, economic relations with entrepreneurs in the United States. It will look for investment and so on, good relations. If that were to be the case, the threat of military action might go away, and as a result of the economic will flourish. The Venezuelan government has taken all decisions now to orient itself towards the East. It's just signed 28 agreements with China, which are extraordinary. And it's produced the petrol, which is based on the price of the barrel of oil. So Venezuela has given itself a floating exchange rate, which is what it needed. And it's dealing with with hyperinflation. And the consequence of this is that the economy is stabilizing, is becoming more equilibrated. And I think the potential that Venezuela has in terms of minerals, oil, gold, diamonds, industry, the agricultural sector, and so on, which were very underdeveloped because they depended so much on the oil, has a huge potential. They're already exploring this quite dramatically. And it seems that if this were to take place in the context of no sanctions and no US threat or blockade, the country will thrive precisely because it's got this incredible amount of assets.
First of all, they will have access to hard currency. That would help Venezuela. But when Maduro will have to lift the strict exchange rate control imposed on the country. Why? Because this strict exchange rate control has enabled the birth of a thriving black market that has created hyperinflation in Venezuela. They have loosened up a bit this restriction. Now Venezuelans are allowed to trade in foreign currencies. But the central bank still controls the exchange rate, and that has made it possible for the black market to create problems. They have to drop that altogether. They did it to avoid capital flight in 2003 by President Chavez. Now there's no capital to fly anymore. So once they do that, that will help. Second, in the reforms of the Constitution, they have included a post-oil economy, which means that they want to reduce Venezuela's dependency on the exports of oil. But that's going to take time. That means that they have to start investing in infrastructure to be able to, first of all, create and build and manufacture those things in which they are not self-sufficient, and therefore they will be able later to export. But they have to break the cycle of dependency on oil to be able to diversify the economy and enable the economy to grow. But it will take time for that to happen.
President Donald Trump told the United Nations General Assembly, "Today, socialism has bankrupted the oil-rich nation and driven its people into abject poverty. We ask the nations gathered here to join us in calling for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela." He made a series of criticisms against the South American country and seemed to show he has an active interest in changing how it is governed. According to senior Venezuelan representatives, the United States admits its officials have met with military coup leaders to carry out an overthrow of the democratically elected government of Venezuela. While the United States seems willing to interfere with the internal affairs of another state, Washington would never tolerate such interference on its own territory. Once again, it's a case of classic double standards. It remains to be seen how far the United States can push its neighbors before its neighbors push back.